that I personally still regret, a significant collapse of the Ethiopian economy, removal of the suspension of Ethiopia's AGOA beneficiary privilege. And that was the biggest problem.
Ethiopia is arguably the most ambitious and most closely watched attempt to make export-led manufacturing work at scale in Africa. And that's only one aspect of the country's wide-ranging set of reforms in recent years, which has seen the government embark on a range of macroeconomic policy changes across exchange rates, taxation, and more. Today we're joined by Mamo Mihretu, who served as the 10th governor of the National Bank of Ethiopia, and before that was a senior economic advisor to the Prime Minister, where he was involved across a range of economic reforms. Mamo, welcome to Ideas in Development.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
So Mamo, I was wondering if you could start by telling us about your route into the policy world and government.
Thank you so much again for having me. My route to government is a bit unusual because I've been looking at, a set of problems from different positions and seats, more or less from three places. I was first working for the World Bank Group, where I looked at trade competitiveness, finance issues, mostly focusing on Eastern Southern Africa. And a few years later, around 2018, following the change of government in Ethiopia, I was invited to join the Ethiopian government. That was a moment of hope, a moment of renewal for Ethiopia, and there was a big opportunity to have significant impact. So I joined the government as a senior policy advisor, where I helped design a set of macro and structural reform programs. So, and then eventually also I moved on and worked in different roles and capacity, including as the founding CEO of Ethiopian Investment Holdings, and then, of course, as you said, the 10th governor of the Central Bank of Ethiopia, where it fell on me to, deliver and implement on a number of economic reform programs in Ethiopia, including, the shift towards a market-based exchange rate regime, the modernization of the monetary policy regime, and also the opening up of the financial sector, and also sort of, fostering the autonomy of the central bank. So I've been in three different, places, as working for a development finance institution, working on, policy design, and also later implementing and delivering these policies. And this gave me an opportunity to, look at, what works, what worked, and what didn't work, and really look at it, from different vantage points, and also address this with some honesty. So that's what was a bit of background and my route to government.
If you could set the scene for us, when you entered government as an advisor, what position was the Ethiopian economy in? What were some of the underlying strengths of the economy, and what were the challenges that you faced?
Around 2018, when I joined the Ethiopian government, if you look at the headline macro figures, it was all positive. The economy was growing double-digit, about 10%. There was significant public infrastructure projects happening in Ethiopia, including in energy. There was significant work in terms of implementing sort of, at that time, a bold industrial park development program. The state was involved in a number of infrastructure projects. And because of that, I think the growth of the economy was sustained. But, that was sort of the broad picture. But if you look at, the engine underneath, there was several problems that surfaced eventually. I think the biggest part is, the Ethiopian growth model, for most part, was driven by public infrastructure investment, driven economic growth approach. And this was, for most part, supported by local financing. It was mostly debt driven, and the government was able to capitalize on sort of captive financing from the domestic financial institutions. There was monetary financing of the budget by the central bank. There was a significant, external financing coming, particularly from China. All of that led to significant growth in Ethiopia. But the problem was, although the economy was growing, all sorts of economic, particularly the financing, source, have reached their limit almost at the same. And that led to a significant macroeconomic imbalance in the Ethiopian economy. It led to a shortage of foreign currency. There was a big inflationary problem in Ethiopia, price stability issues, because of significant financing, again, coming from domestic sources, particularly the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia, which is the largest financial institution in the country, and also external financing that led to both financial sector instability risk and also debt sustainability risk. So there was significant macro imbalance manifested in FX shortage, manifested in inflation, manifested in debt sustainability issue, manifested in limited private sector participation that needed to be addressed. So that was the situation that we faced. And if I may add one point, immediately after we started, tackling it, all sorts of problem happened in Ethiopia. I mean, remember in 2020, COVID, and immediately after that, there was really tragic domestic conflict in Ethiopia. So that further aggravated the problem in the country, particularly the exchange rate premium reached almost 100%. And inflation was close to 30% for 3 years running. So all of this needed to be addressed. And that was the situation that we found ourselves in. And that's the situation that I entered into when I joined the government.
Great. Mamo, we'll return to the macroeconomic issues that you mentioned. Oliver will come back to those. But before doing that, we were keen to hear a bit more about the industrial park efforts that the government made. So industrial parks were one key tool that the government employed at that time and before, and it continues to do so. They were new to Ethiopia and potentially politically divisive. So how did this reform idea actually become government policy?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important question. So the whole industrial park agenda were introduced in Ethiopia, I believe around 2011, 2012, around that timeline. At that time, of course, I was not part of the Ethiopian government. I was working for the World Bank. But, where I was in the World Bank, my task also was to look at finance, competitiveness, industrialization issues. And I was able to observe the thinking and the development of the industrial park agenda in Ethiopia. So in Ethiopia, the industrial park agenda is not just an economic instrument. And for most, it was seen as sort of, ideological pivot. And because of that, at that time, members of the ruling political party felt a little uncomfortable with the idea. And then it was an issue that was very much contested. The idea of an industrial park understood to mean, geographically demarcated area where there will be a liberal economic policy that's separate from the rest of the country, and where you have an anchor foreign investor was a concept that was not familiar at that time, and there was significant debate internally. From my observation, three things happened, during those discussions. The first thing is there was a serious effort, at least, by policymakers at that time, to understand the development and evolution of industrial park in Asian countries. There's an attempt to study that took almost 1 year to study the experience in China, the experience in Vietnam, Singapore, and Korea, South Korea, and even more importantly, countries that are less successful, particularly Nigeria. So that led to a strategy document called Development of Industrial Parks and Industrialization in Ethiopia. And that was used as a consensus building tool to come up with a joint approach for the development of industrial park in Ethiopia. That's one thing that happened. Second thing that happened was, and I think I thought that was very smart. The industrial park agenda was framed not so much as an ideological surrender of sorts, but rather as a tool to address practical problems. The practical problems at that time was shortage of foreign currency, low manufacturing base, low export performance. These were the issues, the problems that the Ethiopian economy faced at that time. And the industrial park was framed and presented as a tool to address those real binding constraints. And so for most people, that was easy to digest and easy to understand and to lend support. But I think the third thing, and I think for me the most important thing, was there was a genuine attempt to develop the institutional infrastructure, the institutions, to not only develop the strategy, but also to implement the strategy. And that makes Ethiopia completely different from other countries that try to implement the same agenda. So we created the Ethiopian Investment Commission, essentially modeled against EDB, the Economic Development Board of Singapore, a new institution called IPDC, Ethiopian Industrial Park Development Corporation, was created again modeled against JTC of Singapore. And the government also created the Ethiopian Investment Board that was chaired by the Prime Minister at that time, that provided overall strategic guidance to the development and implementation of industrial park in Ethiopia. And this is very, very important, because developing an industrial park agenda without the institutional machinery to implement it, that will not take you anywhere. And I think in Ethiopia case, that was exactly what happened. If I may just add one point on this, there was also a concerted effort to develop talent in those institutions in Ethiopia at that time. The people who led those institutions at that time were really, really talented people. People who put development at the center, people who, were very open to learning, particularly learning from the experience of EDB. And there was several attempts to learn from, people who led EDB in Singapore, the cluster-based development approach, Philip Yo, books like Hard Work of EDB. There were books that these people used to read, and the way they approach investment promotion and the way they approach cluster development was second to none. So I think that talent, that core, people of technocrats who were supporting on the industrial park agenda, particularly at the Ethiopian Investment Commission, were instrumental in developing and implementing the industrial park agenda in Ethiopia.
You touched on a couple of points that I just want to ask a couple of follow-up questions on. So one is related to anchor investors. You mentioned that they were a key part of the industrial park strategy. What is the importance of targeting an anchor investor, or what was the importance, and how did the government go about actually doing that?
So this idea of targeting and attracting an anchor investor was implemented as part of the development of the Hawassa Industrial Park. The park itself, the Hawassa Industrial Park itself, was completed in less than a year, the construction of the park itself. And from the construction to export of the first shirt to the US market, it took less than 2 years. And the idea of identifying the anchor investor was done as part of this company called PVH, which is the second, at least at that time, I don't know if that's the case today, the second biggest apparel company behind brands like Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein. This company was targeted, particularly because we knew at that time that if you have the anchor investors, all the supply chain players would come following the anchor investor. And that's precisely what happened in Ethiopia. The policy advisor at that time, the policy advisor to the then prime minister at that time, used to have this concept of queen bee, meaning if you target the main investors, all others will follow. In the case of PVH, PVH came to House Industrial Park, and all the suppliers players in India, in Sri Lanka, in China, I believe about 12 to 40 of them followed and become tenants in the House Industrial Park. So that's what happened. If I may just add one point on this, I think the most important thing that was done during that time was efforts to attract quality investment and the way people handled that, particularly the folks who used to run the Ethiopian Investment Commission at that time. First, there was a personal attention, a personal effort, and a personal commitment to attract investment. And I remember at that time, the commissioner himself used to go to the airport at 3 o'clock in the morning to wait for and receive investors because it matters to really project that desire. Second thing is, the government did a good job, at least in my view, to understand the needs of the investors. What do the investors wanted? They wanted infrastructure. They wanted clean source of energy. They wanted streamlined visa rules. They wanted sort of a shared approach toward this sustainability. And those are the core things that they wanted. And I remember at that time, we did a case study on the investment attraction on house industrial parks. And, most people talk about tax incentives, for example. For these investors, tax incentives was the icing on the cake, but it was never the reason. So they look at the broader picture. And I think Ethiopia was able to attract these investors, number one, because, a clear national vision for manufacturing was presented to them. There was a focus on productivity and competitiveness. There was a focus on sustainability. There was a focus on improving the investment climate. And importantly, there were policymakers who were willing to break into the logjam whenever a problem surfaced. So it's not that problem didn't exist. Rather, it was the case that if the problem exists, then policymakers were willing to confront it and address it. So compared to other countries in the region, Ethiopia was successful, not because, we were the cheapest, but because we were the most credible. And I think that, that helped us, manage attract investment in Ethiopia during those time.
That's a nice segue to my last question on industrial parks, which is what specific bottlenecks, for example, local supplier firms or logistics or standards or skills emerged in the industrial parks? And how did the government unblock those?
Yeah, I think the whole industrial park agenda and broadly the manufacturing agenda was off to a good start. There was real momentum behind it. I think it is, sort of most successful stage, I think around, I believe 2020, 2021, the House Industrial Park alone, created employment opportunity and others too, to around 100,000 people. So it was very important as a source of employment, but also export from industrial parks were increasing. But after that, things happen. For us, a very unfortunate thing was the removal of the suspension of Ethiopia's AGOA beneficiary privilege. And that was the biggest problem. And that was, a serious blow, partly because for the textile sector particularly, competitiveness was based on Ethiopia's ability to export to the US market quota-free and tariff-free. So the moment that you take that away, it affects the competitiveness of the textile sector. And second thing is, the conflict also had significant impact on Ethiopia's manufacturing export prospect and promise. And it's very sad because, had it not been for the removal of the AGOA eligibility, I think Ethiopia's textile exports could have increased significantly. So it's not so much that we lost in terms of actual export revenue because of the cancellation, but more rather because the AGOA beneficiary privilege didn't continue, and the Ethiopian textile sector didn't become what it could have been had it not been for that removal. So an occurrence of what could have been is, I think, sort of a significant development loss